So this is 6:37 GMT, 7:37 is 6:37 GMT in the morning of Tuesday, the 15th of September 2020. This is the first part of the diagnosis of Fleet Street that the newspapers published with a London-centric Little English agenda or Little England agenda from addresses in London, and as they have been for almost 200 years since the mass circulation newspapers began printing from London or publishing from London. And for the Little Englanders, the agenda remains the same. It is back to the darkness, back to the dark age, and they are in denial of the evidence, let alone the truth. And what happened in the House of Commons for a few seconds, maybe 2 minutes at the most, in the actual speech by Ed Miliband. Miliband is my coinage of his name because of his racism, but that's the origin. That's a linguistic note about the origin of the word Miliband. And mini is intended to reflect on his kind of profiting from the fact that his father was Ralph Miliband, the activist, academic, intellectual. And so therefore he is not a genuine, original Miliband as his father could claim to be, not because of his being their father, he isn't David Miliband's father, but because of his original contributions and stance and his principles. So Ed Miliband generally lacks the principles of his father. But yesterday, on Monday, on the floor of the reduced and socially distanced House of Commons in London, he delivered a speech that I have already commented overnight on, that is a game changer for him, career-wise at least. And in terms of the evidence of democratic representative voicing of the concerns and the outrages and the opposition to the Boris Johnson-fronted cabal and cabal, mini cabals of crooks and criminals. What Ed Miliband did is something that Corbyn could have done many times, but Corbyn never was focused on anything in the way that Ed Miliband showed yesterday he was on the question of the particular brazen bill, which is a criminally conceived bill as a breaker of the law, breaker of the contract, breaker of the rule of law, due process, and all the rest of it. And I say that about Corbyn, not as a kind of competition, because I'm not in competition with him. I never had been. And there is nothing to compete where it concerns him or Livingston or any of the others. I am not in the business of competition. I'm in the business of asserting the truth based on the evidence. And what I am saying, despite the fact that I have been factually, evidentially, very seriously, extensively critical of Ed Miliband, this is the one that I recognize as a piece that needs recognition. What he did in that speech, as I said, lasting in my view, because I have seen it on the social media, I didn't see it as it was being live broadcast. So whatever I have seen, whatever the length, constitutes enough evidence to say that Ed Miliband is absolutely correct in that speech to that extent, and that is the kind of speech that should be made 1,000 times more on all aspects of the Boris Johnson-fronted calamity and disgrace that is now upon this community, this country as a whole. And what it represents is a lot of detail that can be used, and this principle can be extrapolated to cover all the other aspects of Boris Johnson's criminality, lying, deception, dishonesty. And the people who have commented, in my knowledge so far, about Ed Miliband have not given him enough credit. I think he deserves more credit than most of those people have given him in the context. And the third thing here is that Ed Miliband showed how Boris Johnson could be cornered. Quite physically, Boris Johnson was unable to stand up and deal with the challenge. This is absolutely a unique piece of theater that lasted a very short time, but it is absolutely the kind of theater that this country needs from its parliament. It hasn't received any such kind of theater for a long time, not in my understanding of it. And what Ed Miliband did was to show Keir Starmer, this is how to corner, physically corner, and make Boris Johnson squirm. He did squirm. He may not have shown it all in his facial expressions, but he did do that. He didn't stand up and he didn't kind of take up the challenge, and he didn't answer, and he couldn't answer. That's the whole point. Miliband put the question to him, the analysis to him, then the question, and then he concluded. So he did three of these essential parts, and that is the way to go, actually. If there is any suggestion that this parliament is justified and the MPs are justified in claiming the money and all the rest of it, we need MPs doing more of this every single day, whether in the House of Commons or outside. They have to be putting that kind of precise, factual, accurate questions and expose the corruption, the criminality, and the real brazenness and shamelessness and outrageous assumption that he can get away with it. He and his likes, Johnson and his ilk, can get away with this kind of brazen behavior and brazen disrespect to society, disrespect to the community, the country, and the backtracking and putting upside down the very things that he stood on when he was harassing Theresa May out of that post. So what is the Daily Mail celebrate today? The Daily Mail is celebrating this diversion. They don't want to give credit to Ed Miliband because it's the Daily Mail that launched an attack immediately after Miliband was elected leader, whatever the internal kind of problems within the party was. And the Daily Mail criminally, dishonestly mounted a series of attacks on Ed Miliband to discredit his credibility to lead the country and to lead the opposition. And they said that his father was an anti-British person, Ralph Miliband. They never had any evidence to say that, but that is what they said. And that is what they would say about anyone who questions their criminal agenda, Boris Johnson's criminal agenda, and Rupert Murdoch's criminal agenda, and Trevor Kavanagh, the poisonous, complete criminality on this scum, and all the other scum that have been given the platform by Murdoch. Their agenda, if you expose their agenda, then you become enemy of the country, enemy of the very patriotism they trade on. Ralph Miliband was not a traitor. He was an absolutely decent individual, and he did more good than 1,000 conservatives, MPs or whatever, put together would ever be able to do a fraction of. Ralph Miliband contributed seriously to the analysis of the sickness of capitalism and corruption and big business and all the other things. So instead of congratulating Ed Miliband for being the son of person like Ralph Miliband, they actually harassed him and they defamed him and they actually demonized him and his father, or demonized him through his father, or demonized him through by demonizing his father, who was beyond that kind of reproach and demonization. So yesterday, Monday, the 14th of September 2020, should be marked as a day to celebrate for democracy, because democracy is such a precious thing. I mean, having understood everything that Churchill said about democracy being the worst thing, but that is the better than the alternative. So that is the premise from where I come, to talk about democracy. And this is something that should be emulated and repeated. And I noticed the body language of Rachel sitting to Ed Miliband's or Ed Miliband's left, to the right of the viewer, but to his left as he spoke. Rachel Reeves. Now, she was not showing any emotion really. She was appearing to be concentrating on what he was saying, but she was not actually processing the impact of what Ed Miliband was saying. We processed it. As soon as I saw it, it was instantly obvious how absolutely different that item of speech making was from the whole lot of things that have been going on for the last many years. And so I'm quite happy to give Ed Miliband the credit for that, and also for serving as a role kind of model in terms of making the speeches, not all the honesty and integrity that he needs to show, but that is the beginning. And the daily, I'll come to the sketch writer, the poisonous sketch writer of the daily Boris Johnson Mail. And they're saying that Keir Starmer was coughing, so therefore he has gone into self-isolation. And they're admitting the disastrous failure of the testing regime. It's absolutely all over the place. That is what they're having to admit. And they're promoting this so-called explosive book by the wife of the ex-MP, Hugo Square. And there is a Craig Brown piece on Hugo Square. The Craig Brown column that writes, and it takes a kind of Mickey. And this Henry Deeds does include a spot on the performance of the speech by Ed Miliband. Let's see what Henry Deeds is. The replacement of Quentin, the racist denier of the truth, who has partly defected to the Murdoch kind of stable. And he's having a go at Ed Miliband. Instead of noting what he said that he had been bursting for his chance, rocking back and forth excitedly and pumping his legs as he waited for his turn. He was keener than a college leaver at first job interview. The bill was not an argument of leave versus remain, but an argument about right versus wrong, he said. To give Ed his due, he was better than I thought he would be, but he still debates the same way he goes at a bacon sandwich, awkwardly without delicacy or guile. Now that's a complete stupidity on the part of these Deeds. This Henry Deeds could be possibly related to Bill Deeds of the Daily Boris Graph, of the past, but we shall leave that for the minute. We shall examine the connection. So this idiot is condemning Ed Miliband more than he is condemning, acknowledging the role he played in that speech. So I'm not going to even read the rest of it because it is attacking Ed Miliband for something compared to the whole scene of the last, let's say, 12 years of the House of Commons in terms of the opposition for the last 10 years and the kind of anti-conservative diagnostics or analysis. That was a rare piece of speech making. As I said, it lasted very short kind of length of time, but it was absolutely, exceptionally kind of well deserved and well overdue. So this should be celebrated, marked. Instead, the Daily Mail moron is attacking him and undermining him. And there is this reluctant kind of piece by one of the writers. He's the Ross Clark, who is saying that the coronaphobia, he's calling it, is turning our land of liberty into a Stasi-like state, land of liberty. That is a completely criminally stupid and ignorant claim. Liberty has been under attack all the time in this country. And Richard Littlejohn, the less read out of him, the better. He is sickness personified. There are so many sick individuals writing in the tabloids in the Fleet Street, like Trevor Kavanagh, Richard Littlejohn, Jeremy Clarkson, Rod Liddell. These are some of the sicknesses personified, embodied by these people. And they are the sickos that are contaminating the gullibles and the majority of the people who read the stuff as without any criticism, without any understanding or context or knowledge or awareness or facilities to research the environment in which they suffer the readings of these personifications of poison and lies and racism. So these are the people that are actually collectively, daily brainwashed into kind of staying in the state of stupor and the state of ignorance. And these are the problems because these people are not looking at the truth, not searching for the truth, let alone acting for the truth. So society suffers as a result of this ignorance and this darkness that is perpetuated by Fleet Street newspapers and media every single day. Ed Miliband has been given a reluctant space by the BBC online. They didn't run with that. They have led with the win of the so-called kind of vote on that bill. So they led with the win, but they should have led with Boris Johnson's absolute humiliation, objectively speaking. Well, objectively speaking, is a word that is misused by Mr. James O'Brien in his Twitter thing. He didn't give credit to Ed Miliband as much as he would have done had he kind of been open and honest. So he said objectively it was a good performance or whatever, but he didn't give enough contextual, evidential, ethically justified, morally justified credit to Ed Miliband on that particular speech. So the Daily Mail is not giving any space to the opposition or the idea of the opposition to the crooks that are in the seats of or spaces of, quote, state power in this country now. And we shall be and they're saying that sarcasm helps people overcome heart illness and avoid heart illness, that kind of thing. And there is this. There is this celebration of the 80 years old kind of legacy of the war against the Nazis on 2 pages. So there is no recognition by the Daily Mail of the crisis that the country has been caused, and the country is being denied the service of accountable, honest, law-abiding, due process government. And there is nothing in the Daily Mail today that suggests that they are in any hurry to put the finger of blame at Johnson. They are listing the failures, but they are prepared to still give him credit for the failures. Can you imagine? That is what they're doing. And the Daily Star is leading with the stupid idea that Britain is hotter than Hawaii, but it's not connecting. It's not connecting that headline, or it's not leading the front page headline by emphasizing the reason for it, the climate change. They are among the climate change deniers, this Daily Star, as they are among the deniers of the truth about Boris Johnson's failures and the failures of the conservative, right-wing or the fascists, and the lack of proper opposition. And the proof is that their headline, the heading leading editorial, so-called, is a lament at the sacking of the sports personality, question of sports presenter, Sue Barker. That's their main concern. And they are having a go at rule of 6, and there is nothing about the housing crisis, there is nothing about the poverty, there is nothing about the violations every day, in addition to the violations of the treaty, withdrawal agreement, and other legal obligations, the daily violations of all the legal duties by the state and the local agencies, and the creation of the perpetuation of the poverty and hunger and deprivation of various stages and various degrees to millions of people in this country. Most of the people, overwhelming number of the victims of those deprivations and denials and dislocations and disentitlements are what is called the indigenous white people. And there is a rare piece in the Daily Mirror where Boris Johnson is pictured at the end of the day of hunting. So Boris Johnson goes hunting. Is there anything to add to that cruelty of his life as personality? And then they've got on page 2 a piece that is correct about the stance of Boris Johnson, not correct about their interpretation of it, but that is what they're saying, that he said that the deal I signed is so terrible, I just can't support it. So what can he support? And that is the answer to the question, because he never supported anything out of principle. And that is where the secret of the boast by his father Stanley Johnson and his sister Rachel Johnson lies. When he condemned Muslim women for wearing the face coverings, can you imagine? This is ironic. The very face covering culture has now overwhelmed the whole world. And there he was condemning Muslim women for having that culture or cultural option and condemning them as bank robbers or looking like bank robbers. The entire world is now open to that kind of accusation by Boris Johnson. The entire world population is now resembling millions and billions of people of bank robbers. And there is a little quip at Boris Johnson, rule of six. And that is what they're saying. This thing at the bottom of the Daily Mirror's so-called editorial kind of column. I'll read this out. This is supposed to be a conversation between Johnson and his so-called fiancée or girlfriend or next wife, I don't know. So, can I have all my children round for dinner at once? How many was it again? And his girlfriend or fiancée says, well, if you don't know. And so therefore there is a kind of personal thing about his adulterous life and his personal unreliability and treachery to his series of his girlfriends and wives and whatever. And then they've got this typically Daily Mirror diversions, and they don't talk about the lack of accountability in the health kind of business or health industry or health service. And they don't talk about the lack of accountability in Parliament. Now, have they got Ed Miliband there? So I've got on page 2, and they're saying that Ed Miliband rebuked Johnson. But they have not gone anywhere near reporting that particular speech, that it deserves to be reported in. And that is the agenda of the Daily Mirror, which is supposed to be a so-called anti-conservative, pro-Labour newspaper. That should have been the front page, or that should have been the main essay, what Ed Miliband did. But the Daily Mirror failed because it hasn't got people, the Daily Mirror, all the political commentators and all the rest of it. They are too timid, too ignorant, and too little-brained. They haven't got the whole perspective. They don't have the view that takes the whole world view. And the ramifications of these law-breaking regime, they haven't got it. So, and that is despite the fact that one of their numbers he appears more on television talking about headlines or the contents of the newspapers and sharing itsy-bitsy gossip bits that he picks up in the so-called corridors. Kevin Maguire and his kind of colleague from the Daily Mail is a partnership of opportunist, self-serving, Fleet Street kind of careerists. They don't contribute any substance, no morality, no ethics of any sustainable kind or quality to sustainable journalism. So these are some of the more well-known or better known on these screens. They appear on the ITV, Good Morning Britain, they appear on the BBC News channels, newspaper peddling, and they appear on the Sky News counterpart. But they don't bring any substance. And the reason why we call it this broadcast world exclusive diagnosis of the Fleet Street is because none of the existing so-called mainstream counterparts or slots apparently previewing or reviewing the press comes anywhere near looking at the immorality, the corruption, the racism, the emptiness that we are here serving exclusively. And for the benefit of anyone who might watch it, or for the record, the first thing is to say it on the record. That is what we do. And they've got the Times, today's Times. Let's see what they're doing. They're talking on page 8. The headline is Disadvantaged Young Man Earn 50% Less in Economic Cold Sports. Now that's a typically patronizing, matronizing attitude shown by the Times. They don't take responsibility for the state of disadvantage that these young men are in. Every single edition of the Times, as the rest of the Fleet Street mainstream media, or their kind of imitations published from various addresses in the so-called provinces and regional centers, every single publication, every single article, every single so-called report is artificial, falsified. It's not original, it's not truthful, it is not designed to be truthful. It is falsified to suit the particular agenda, the narrative that the controllers of these publications want to promote. That is why there is so much disadvantage, so much poverty and denial of access to equality and rights in this country. And so, likewise, as Frances Gibb, who was for about 20 years the legal editor at the Times, I mean, she showed total subservience to the legal establishment corruptocracy. She didn't want to publish any investigative reports about the serious state of dysfunction and criminality that is perpetrated under the covers of the legal system. And she didn't investigate anything that is wrong with the so-called legal aid that is now almost gone. But when it was in its prime and it was being exploited to the full by the licensed law trading criminals, barristers and solicitors, in other words, she never published anything shockingly revelatory. And I'm saying that because the report by this person, Andrew Norfolk is it, into the Muslim organized gang rapists of girls in the northern cities. That shows that the entire status quo everywhere, including the Times, was refusing to publish the truth for years. For such a long time, these girls were being targeted and exploited and abused and raped and their lives being destroyed, but nothing in the papers, nothing in the mainstream, nothing in Fleet Street, nothing in the Yorkshire Post, which is where it happened, some of it or most of it or many of it, published anything. And none of the mainstream television channels did that. And that is because there is no accountability. There is no culture of accountability as a rule. So there is no rule of law. There is no due process in the behavior of the local councils or the localized police forces. because they are all interconnected and they support one another, cover for one another, and they cover up. So the Times was guilty of covering up and of being in denial for all those years when the girls were being targeted and raped and violated and kidnapped and whatever else they were being kind of victimized by and were victims of. And this two-page piece on yesterday's goings on in the House of Commons in the Times, 2 pages 6 and 7, does contain a still image of Ed Miliband, and this political sketch by Quentin Letts doesn't give Ed Miliband the credit in the headline, but he does mention Ed Miliband. So at least that is better, or at least more than the Daily Mail morons have done. And he says, Quentin Letts says that incident was part of a facing off between Ed and Boris. That is not what it was. It was not a face off at all. Boris Johnson was nowhere near comparable in that episode to what Ed Miliband said. So this is the 2-page coverage of the so-called politics of the House of Commons yesterday. And that's where Quentin Letts is showing this and the close-up of Ed Miliband is there. Well, as close as the camera would accommodate. So that is the kind of reluctance on the part of the Times and the likes of Quentin Letts, who is recognized one of the worst offending racists and misogynists and liars in place in the Fleet Street stables. And they won't acknowledge such performance, and they would not most certainly acknowledge any brilliant repetition of what Ed Miliband did yesterday, because they don't recognize, for a start, that is the thing, they are in denial of the alternative, which is the better than the current status quo. They are in denial of that on purpose, not because the alternative deserves to be sidelined, but the alternative is overpoweringly rational and objectively attractive. And that is what they're scared of. That is why they are in denial of that. And that is the logic of the wrongdoers against the right doers, if you like. And that is what is happening in the British politics. And it is in a deadlock. And what Ed Miliband did yesterday is the glimpse of the possibility of breaking that deadlock and removing these offenders from power and posts, and delivering or beginning to deliver democracy to these people in this country, and democratic accountability and fairness and legality and constitutionality and ethical and moral accountability to the people who have been denied and deprived of all of these for too long. And the Times is going lazy. Now, I don't know what they've done to this cartoonist called Peter Brooks. They have suppressed him or something, or he's on holiday or something, I don't know. They don't say that, but that is the time. This is the kind of cartoon that actually would have been kind of better if it was replaced by a Peter Brooks treatment of Ed Miliband's kind of exposition or expose on Boris Johnson. And this is a kind of lazy, labored kind of work on the Rule Britannia thing. It's obviously tottering from the top of the tower of this clock. But that's a labored one. It's not a spontaneous one. It doesn't really read spontaneously. Although, of course, Rule Britannia is complete rubbish. To claim Rule Britannia now in the context of the evidence of the last 70 years is complete joke. But the joke is made worse by the likes of Boris Johnson being allowed to stay in that kind of position, and by the likes of the Tories overwhelming 80 majority, who completely were blind when they voted this thing through yesterday, despite Ed Miliband's performance and despite the evidence in front of their eyes. They have no common sense. They don't even understand the difference between rule of law and breaking of the law. So, and Ed Miliband, of course, as I said, he had earlier spoken about the Magna Carta, which he mentioned in that speech as well. And there is a stupid letter singing the praise of HS2. And they're celebrating the big business in Silicon Valley, and there is nothing. There is no investigation in the Times, and there is no evidence of there any kind of interest in investigating the corruption that we are suffering from the government of lawbreakers and unconstitutional, anti-constitutionalists. And this racist Melanie Phillips, these racist liars like Melanie Phillips are given these platforms. And there is no counter to her lies and their lies in Fleet Street. There is no contradiction. And the Times is saying, giving the list of people who are former office holders in successive governments opposing Boris Johnson's kind of law-breaking thing. That is true. But that should not be on the front page. The front page should have been Ed Miliband's speech with an illustration of it, with his various kind of images or frames of frozen kind of stills from that particular speech. That is, I would say, in terms of Fleet Street, that would be more than well deserved. But because Fleet Street is hostile to Labour and hostile to the idea of the Labour Party, opposing the Conservatives and the ideal and the narrative, that they are being narrow-minded in denying Ed Miliband that kind of prominence and that kind of report and coverage. And they're now talking about this one. This is the one that about this. This is the Daily Mail also running a feature on this one about number of people reporting lockdown breaks and social distancing rules. And there, in fact, the Sun is saying that Brussels, that the EU, still has revolver on the table against Britain. That is how criminally stupid and dishonest and untrue that is. Instead of saying that Boris Johnson is breaking the law and the contract, and it's not just one contract, it is at the very foundation of the so-called common law principle. And in addition to breaking the actual constitutions and legislations and statutes in the context of the EU. And they're having a double spread as well against the mingling and all that. But they're not talking about the numbers of people being neglected, numbers of people being consigned to poverty and suffering, numbers of people facing increased lack of housing rights and home rights, and no peace about how the courts are preparing to make hundreds of thousands homeless. and they're celebrating Rishi Sunak's plot to do something to aid big business, and they're they're interpreting that as a pro-Brexit move. And there is nothing about society, nothing about the economy, nothing about actual criminality and the lack of action to literally save millions of young persons from lives, disastrous, aimless, and unfulfilling lives. That is the Sun. And of course, they are running the typical sub-pornographic details, which are absolutely part of their agenda and business. They are not bothered about society, not bothered about democracy, and there is no space in Fleet Street papers about the local denial of democracy, accountability, anything on the local council's failures, regardless of the political color of the councils concerned. The general principle is that they are not bothered about local democracy. Now, to put it in perspective, local councils have the biggest share of contacts with the people in the local areas about any policy. So local councils are absolutely central. And yet, looking at Fleet Street, you will see the emptiness, the blankness, the complete and utter kind of lack of any space to covering local activities, local campaigns, local failures, local lack of engagement with the people's needs, and the distribution of the funds compared to the needs of the community and the actual availability by central government, let alone any contextual reference to the things like £100 billion being paid to the big business under covers of various deals on dealing with the virus. And yet all the papers are full of news that they are compelled to run, that this is not working, the testing is not working, the social distancing is not working, lockdown is not working. So there is a big need for the details of what is happening locally and what is happening to the big amounts of money being kind of extracted in the name of the public and being given to big business. Only a small number of people control the access to billions of pounds that the Tories are handing over to them at the expense of the whole community and the whole country. And while the councils, despite the valid criticism on many of the aspects of their behavior, still need the funding, and they're being starved of funding in many respects, and there is no acknowledgement of that. And reading the Fleet Street papers, it is also obvious that they don't recognize the world. There is no world outside of this island, which is absolutely absurd, because most of the economic kind of activities and economic kind of access and rights and losses and gains in this country are linked with the rest of the world. So this Little Englander mentality of excluding the world from the coverage is a criminal offense. It should be prosecutable, as I said yesterday. These newspapers are not newspapers. These are liars, and they are lying as a criminal act, and they should be prosecuted, and there should be some way of prosecuting them. There is no kind of forum to hold them to account like the used to be Press Complaints Commission, which was a complicit extension of the perpetuating press barons and press big business owners of the big titles. So there has to be a tribunal, there has to be a due process forum somewhere in this country to hold the lying newspapers, the denying newspapers, the anti-democratic newspapers, the hate-spewing, hate-spreading newspapers, and the media counterparts in broadcasting, television, and radio to account to the common good, account to the common accountability standard. There isn't any. And all of that, I'm saying, again, by referring to what Ed Miliband delivered in that short kind of speech. It was short in length, but it was very good in substance, in the context of all the failures. I'm not saying objectively, independently, it would be on its own the best speech. But in the context of the reality of the evidence now and of the last 10 years, that was a single most important short speech by any member of the Labour Party or any member on the opposition, or come to that, any member on the front bench. And I'm including the various false occasions when Michael Gove, who is the patsy, who is the agent of Rupert Murdoch, who organized the stage show of interviewing Donald Trump immediately after the so-called election in 2016. Gove has been praised many times as destroying Jeremy Corbyn or the opposition by the Beaver Brooks lying legacy, the Daily Express, many times. But what Ed Miliband did yesterday deserves to be recognized for what it represents. He cleanly had the facts right, and he summarized it neatly, and he delivered the conclusion absolutely deftly. And that is the kind of performance and the delivery and the contents and substance that needs to be seen every single day. And this is a rare kind of use of the word fails by the Boris Club. Because this is the rare, very rare. They're saying that Boris Johnson fails. I mean, this is something that is absolutely unbelievable. The Boris Club is saying that Boris Johnson fails. I mean, that is beyond imagining. And their poisonous associate editor, Camilla Tomini, is also beginning to see which way the objective opinion is moving. Not the majority opinion, because in terms of the number of votes that the Conservatives can command in the House of Commons as it is constituted, Boris Johnson would not lose any votes. But in the substance, on the outside, generally on the evidence, the substantive argument is totally against Boris Johnson. The evidence is against Boris Johnson and his cabal. And that is what Camilla Tomini is recognizing. And I think, although she is not necessarily praising Ed Miliband, but she is actually seeing the reading on the walls. I'm saying reading, not the writing. And I'll tell you why. Because some of the readings, some of the writings are being obscured by the people who are only partly reporting what is on the walls. And I think this is the time, whether it be Ed Miliband or any other MP from the Labour Party ranks, this is the time to stage the parliamentary democratic upheaval for the sake of the country, for the sake of democracy, for the sake of public health, public good, and for the sake of humanity. Because what happens with the dysfunctioning British government, if there is a madman like Trump back in the White House and he declares war on everything, where does Britain go? And as the United Nations began yesterday, the 45th kind of sitting of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, the imperative is absolutely maximum on the UK as a Security Council member to do everything and to be seen to be doing everything that is not only compatible, but is actually carrying out the objectives and purposes of the founding conventions of the United Nations and the charters and the declarations and the treaties that followed from that, and including the Human Rights Convention. It's nothing to do with the EU, but that is what the Brexiteers and Boris Johnson are trying to distortedly kind of package into their anti-Brexiteering narrative. And yesterday, Ed Miliband, as I said, he spoke very briefly, so it could not be literally kind of turned into a long, detailed account of everything wrong that Boris Johnson was doing on his. So there is a piece on the Lesbos migrants on page 13 of the Daily Boris graph, and it's in the wake of the burning down of the camp, the refugee camp, and it's something that is rare in the Telegraph, at least. And the victims of the fire, migrants, are too scared and too disgusted by the attitude of the Greek government, which has been tear gassing them and attacking them in other ways. They are refusing to go there. And there is a role here for Britain as a member of the United Nations, leading member of the United Nations. And the point that, or one of the points that Ed Miliband included in his speech was that the founding of the United Nations was done and made possible by significant contribution by members of the delegation or the members of the political kind of groupings in Britain who took part in the formation of the United Nations. So that is not just a peripheral issue on the side, it is a central issue affecting the world as a whole. And the time is not soon, and it's not too soon to expect Britain to begin to play a part as the member of the Security Council as concerned, and as the founder, as one of the leading founders of the United Nations. That kind of speech, that kind of recognition of the United Nations coming from a member of parliament who is a Labour Party member of parliament is long overdue. And I think that Keir Starmer should take that as a model list of things that Labour should be pursuing. What, not necessarily just about Ireland, this is what Ed Miliband is focusing on, but the principle, he should extrapolate that and apply the principle that was outlined by Ed Miliband to other issues and other topics of urgent attention, deserving urgent attention and safeguarding of the public, providing a really, actually relevant and effective national health service and caring health service, and care for the community, care for the elderly, and dignified employment, dignified income, dignified housing, dignified accountability by the local councils. That is the list that I would emphasize time and again that needs to be actually implemented and the beginning made. And so therefore Ed Miliband actually has done a very good service to the cause of democracy and to the cause of accountability and humanity and human rights, and the cause of constitutionality and the cause of peace across the world, because Britain can play a part, overdue part, in bringing an end to wars and the causes of people having to migrate from their country and seek refuge in this country or in Greece or similar countries in the West. Now there is a very ironic headline in the Boris graph on page 23. 80 years ago, a determined national effort saw off a Nazi invasion, says Richard Overy. But the main headline to this is an echo of the slogan that Jeremy Corbyn kind of adopted in the kind of ending last years of his leadership. It says the many won the battle of Britain, not just the few. That's a very, very overdue kind of acknowledgement of the many, and also a reluctant acceptance of the analysis that the many are the ones who do the real deserving of the credit for society and everything that is good for society. And that is not too soon for the Daily Torygraph to emulate. And there are other items about the BBC. BBC's new Director General is continuing the attacks on the idea of the public service broadcasting. That's what I say about the NHS as well. I don't say there is an NHS. I say there is an idea of an NHS which has been suffocated for the last 70 plus years since its foundation. And it is time that it is liberated and the stranglehold has been removed from it by removing the powers that the consultants have been holding and the pharmaceutical companies and giants that have been robbing it for 70 plus years. And that can be only possible by an effective and ideologically, democratically accountable, transparent, moral, and ethical Labour Party in Parliament in the democratic mold. And what is happening here on this editorial page of the Torygraph, or Boris Graph, they are talking about the ministers needing to get a grip on mass testing of the virus. Now, how dare Charles Moore, the official liar, get to have this headline to a piece he has written. He is paying tribute to Terence Conran, an enlightenment genius cast into the darkness. He is giving him credit as an enlightened person, but I have said yesterday, Terence Conran did not shape my life and did not shape most of the lives of the people of the many. And so therefore they're lying about his contribution. And the Telegraph is totally in the darkness in the rest of its coverage, despite those reluctant concessions to the phrase, the many, not the few. And their coverage, again forced by the evidence on the front page, page 1, lead story, the crisis in hospitals with health workers unable to access tests. That is enough evidence that the Torygraph, the Boris Graph has been wrong to peddle the lies of Boris Johnson on anything. And he should apologize and he should withdraw all the lies and the bribery that it actually perpetrated in funding Boris Johnson for the last, 12 years or so, or even longer. So there is this Matt cartoon which is overly praised by other Fleet Street kind of self-serving careerists. This is a lazy and again kind of dishonest cartoon. Matt actually suits his cartoon topics depending on the narrative, particular kind of narrative, the right-wing narrative. He's not ever anything other than that. And it's saying, the hand over all the bread, or I'll tell a COVID marshal you were in a gathering of more than 6 people. Now that is a double-barreled attack on the idea of restricting people's gathering. I'm not saying that 6 is the ideal. I'm not a kind of commentator basing this on a particular clinical study that I have taken part in. But essentially there has to be restriction, there has to be agreement, consensus among the people, among the public, based entirely on public health grounds, that we have to make adjustments and arrangements, rearrange our kind of movement and work and locations and all the other things in order to contribute to an agreed objective to deal with this illness and to save as many lives, protect as many lives as possible. And that is something that these failures are obviously undermining that objective. But the Telegraph is not blaming Boris Johnson and his regime for this failure. That's the thing. Neither the Telegraph, nor the Daily Mail, nor the Sun, nor the Star, nor the Daily Express blaming where the blame lies, that the government is in disarray. So the John Ashworth, the so-called opposition Labour Party spokesman in the name of health, has commented reportedly that Boris Johnson's boast about dealing with the virus crisis as a world-class kind of success is not true. What he has said is that Boris Johnson's failures show world-class shambles, world-beating shambles. That is the phrase, world-beating shambles. I think Ashworth has been quoted by The Guardian yesterday or overnight, whichever is the case. That's where it comes from, I think. And here the I newspaper, again, is sucking up to Boris Johnson instead of giving credit to Ed Miliband for a very overdue and rare performance that the whole country benefits from. They're saying that bruising commons victory for Johnson. That's not a rare thing. That has been the case. Boris Johnson is getting victory after victory due to the fact that these newspapers are complicit with the agenda, that no matter how disastrous he is, they have to give him positive benefit of the doubt. And again, inside the pages, they are not talking about Miliband in anywhere similar or this is not a picture they should be running. They should have been running that picture where he was seen kind of squirming while Ed Miliband was on his feet. That is the picture that should have been there. The I newspaper claims to be now independent of the two bears and all the rest of it, but it's not independent, sufficiently independent at all. And their failure is a failure for the whole country, because Fleet Street, the rest of the Fleet Street is failing, and it is actually promoting Boris Johnson, no matter how disastrous, how dishonest Boris Johnson is and his cabal is. But there is no contrary, accountable kind of platform given to the opposition, ideological, evidential opposition, democratic opposition, not necessarily based on party, but the evidential opposition that the country deserves. There is nothing in the Independent on any of those. The I newspaper, that is. The Independent title is no longer in print available. It's online only, but this is an offshoot of the Independent when it was the Independent in print, the I newspaper. And it took over the circulation because of the tactic or the strategy they adopted of making it brief and short. So the Guardian today, which has been available today from the outlet where we get the papers, is saying, again, it's saying about the numbers increasing. And also it's saying that number 10 is warned of 7,000 lorries stuck in post-Brexit chaos. That's what they're running the front page with. I shall come to how they are treating and reporting this Ed Miliband kind of intervention. But they're not mentioning Miliband in the headlines on the front page, The Guardian. So what it shows is that even The Guardian is refusing to cover truthfully the extent of Boris Johnson's failures and the disaster. And what Ed Miliband did was much more effective than any of the combined criticism made by the 5 ex-prime ministers. Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, John Major, David Cameron, Theresa May. These five are put in a gallery by the Guardian as being critics of Johnson. But they don't have a picture of Ed Miliband there. Now, what is going on in the Guardian? That was by, as James O'Brien has said, and I agree with that description, objectively, that was the most significant speech. Okay, so what have they left? They have left it to John Crace to deal with the Ed Miliband interpretation. And let me see what. So they have got a picture in the piece that is the so-called sketch writer John Crace. Currently, the sketch writer John Crace is covering that one. Let's see what he's saying. And I think that John Crace is following the corrupt agenda of the Guardian. He is saying reluctantly in the whole reading of it that Boris Johnson has a humiliation threshold, and Ed Miliband found it. That is true, but that is far less than the truth of the whole thing. And I'm going to look for the whole. He says, on the plus side, we, the viewers, the public, were treated to one of the best speeches of this and recent parliaments from Ed Miliband, as he comprehensively ripped Boris Johnson's facile and fraudulent argument to shreds. Now that is more like it. That is the paragraph that actually sums up the Guardian view, let's say. I have said more than that. I have said it has represented, and it does represent a lot more than that. But that is the coming to an approximation of what should be said. But it should have been said in the headline, news headline. This is a sketch. This is not the news item about that particular intervention by Ed Miliband. But that shows the Guardian is still suffocating, self-suffocating, and refusing to go all out on exposing the corruption of the government, the lies of the government, and that is where they're letting the country down. And the rest of the Guardian is covered in this kind of self-suffocating reluctance to go all out, to tell the truth about the Conservatives and Boris Johnson and his rest of the gang. This is where Josh Halliday's report includes the thing that I mentioned earlier. World-beating shambles. That's what Jonathan has said, Boris Johnson's failure. Jonathan Ashworth has said that is where I saw it. It was in the piece by Josh Halliday and Stephen Morris. Testing and meltdown as people turned away in COVID hotspots. Now, on the other page, which is page 12, families of care home residents face tighter restrictions as infections rise. Now, they're doing the same things now. What they're doing is they're restricting members of the family from visiting their relatives in care homes. Now, that is not going to help these people, because they are not talking about the rest of the kind of behavior, rest of the conduct. Because care homes suffer from a whole range of neglectful activities and lack of supervision, lack of resources, lack of attention, lack of audit. And the whole process of looking after these people, if they are being looked after at a crisis like this, because they are abandoned to die out of negligence. That is what happened in the last kind of wave few months ago. If they are left to die without care, then what's the point of them being there and being, the places being called care homes? So there is no accountability. And here is a piece by The Guardian, typical piece, which says that BBC has given rises to more than 700 women since the equal pay scandal. Now, that is fine. We support that. But the BBC paying more doesn't deal with the BBC's lying, the actual delivery of lies by these women as part of the BBC agenda. That's what the Guardian needs to examine. It doesn't examine. And it doesn't say what these women getting the rises are doing to the content, to the narrative, to the actual agenda, the bias and the suppression of the truth. And what is the reason why some of these people, they've got faces of white women as well as Asian women and African women among them. So what do they do? Do they actually deliver the truth? Do they actually stop racist restrictions? Only because they are, like Claire Forges said in the Times yesterday, that jobs based on ethnicity, etc., would kind of create division. Now, these people are being given the jobs and the commissions and the contracts. These people are given the jobs, the commissions and the contracts. But are they given the jobs and the commissions and the contracts to end the denial and the suppression, the bias and the racism in the jobs that they are hired and given contracts to deliver, to perform? That is not covered in The Guardian, nor is it covered in any of the other coverage. And that should be evidence. The fact that it is not is the diagnostic finding of this program, as it has been of this campaign and the movement. Now, the Beaverbrook Express wakes up and says that for the sake of 35,000 people's lives, we must act now. And what is it saying by act? It is talking about the 35,000 people, cancer sufferers. That's what it is saying. So it's part of the narrative, which is to say that the virus is less important than all the other things. That is the narrative they have found as a way of excusing the failures, world-beating shambles that Jonathan Ashworth calls it, and they are diverting attention. And as I said, cancer, I said yesterday, Monday, the 14th of September, cancer is a health issue, as is the virus. So why do they pit cancer sufferers against the virus sufferers? They should be treated as suffering from illness, disease, and deserving treatment. Note this. This is a diversion. This is a wrongfully done diversion. It's a scripted diversion. And there is a 2-page apologia, an excuse for Boris Johnson again, by the Beaverbrook Legacy of Lying, the Daily Express. But it has accidentally carried this picture of semi-squirming Boris Johnson when Ed Miliband was delivering his speech. That's the one, semi-squirming. But they don't give him the full exposure, but anyone interested can go into the kind of online files. and view the whole picture by Ed Miliband. And that will be including the full state of Boris Johnson's face. When Ed Miliband repeatedly invited him to stand up, he said, Ed Miliband said, I'll give way, let him stand up and answer. Boris Johnson didn't. He shifted in his seat, shifted uncomfortably and clearly uncomfortably. And that is what I'm saying. He should have been treated to by Jeremy Corbyn. But Corbyn didn't do that. And the rest of the Express is completely typical Daily Express, denial and lying. So where is the Financial Times taking us today? The Financial Times has got a health supplement, but the front page is about the Oracle TikTok partnership facing a White House obstacle. That is for a bit later. That is a bit later. The first outlet from Fleet Street today contains a glimpse of that picture when Boris Johnson was. This was taken during his squirming kind of moments. And that face is authentic expression that he put on, an authentic expression that he put on during the speech that Ed Miliband delivered. Why am I going on about this? Because it is absolutely unique performance. And it has not been seen the like of for a very long time in the House of Commons, where it should have been seen the like of 100,000 times in the last decades, but it hasn't been. So it was pinpointing and pinning Boris Johnson to a set of his lies and stupidities. And as I said before, even Boris Johnson can speak in Latin, but Latin is only a language. Latin does not amount to a superiority of sainthood attached to it. Anyone can tell lies in Latin as they can tell lies in any other language. And Boris Johnson speaking in Latin doesn't excuse him being treated as if he is above lying. He is, in fact, he uses Latin as a diversion and as a trick to deflect attention from his lying personality and career. So that is the Financial Times talking about that encounter. And they're saying in the headline, sitting tight, Johnson holds firm over bill. But that's not true. He doesn't hold firm. What they're saying, they should be saying, in the context of what happened and in the context of the implications for the law breaking, because Financial Times for the previous whole week has been leading on the front page in the reporting of Boris Johnson breaking international law. So the Financial Times, of all the titles on Fleet Street, should have followed up yesterday's performance by Miliband, not the voting. Because the voting is guaranteed. It's an infantile, stupid thing to say that he won the vote. He would win the vote because there are too many conservatives there and they're not going to rebel, as I said yesterday, despite the fact that the Attorney General, former Attorney General, this Jeffrey Cox and others had, quote, rebelled. This won't make any difference in terms of the voting, I said yesterday, and it didn't. So it's not something of a miracle. It's not something of a revelation. What is a miracle in the context of the depth of democracy and debate in the House of Commons for the last 10 years or 12 years or 15 years is that there was some MP who actually managed to give a speech that made Boris Johnson squirm. That should be the headline there, not the fact that it's obvious, it's a given that he would have won that so-called vote. It's a kind of ritual. It wasn't a challenge. And the Tory MPs are not going to rebel. That is what I said yesterday, and that is what they did before and after the 19th of December 2019 so-called election. the so-called election, because it shouldn't have been allowed to happen, as I said. But Corbyn, being intellectually deficient, allowed him that opportunity. And that is why we have got a Johnson in place. And we shouldn't have, because he should have been stopped in his tracks. And there is a kind of follow-up on page 2 of the Financial Times that Boris is taking steps to quell the rebellion over Brexit law. That's a change of the headline, the change of the content of the headline. It's not Brexit law. It's international law breaking, legal excuse, criminally conceived. And the US wildfire, so-called, is reported in the Financial Times. And the one vaccine maker, is warning of too few global doses. So what this is exposing, this whole pandemic and the various governments and the states' behavior is showing, is that all the trillions of pounds that they spend in statecraft on state structures, most of the needs of the ordinary people day to day are being left unaddressed and unserved. That's what it exposes, the pandemic, the world epidemic of this disease, and the unpreparedness, lack of preparedness and lack of service to meet the needs of the people affected, shows that the trillions of pounds or dollars being spent in keeping the states and the regimes in place are being wasted. So we shall be stopping here this edition at 4 minutes past 8 GMT on Tuesday, the 15th of September 2020.